listening to The US History Understanding This Country, a podcast where we follow the story of the United States like it's been told to curious minds sitting on a veranda in Kerala or a coffee shop in New Jersey. I'm glad you're back. In our last episode, we saw how years of a disagreement over slavery, new territories, and political power turned into something much more serious. We saw the country split down the middle, southern states breaking away after Abraham Lincoln was elected, forming their own government. The tension that had been boiling for decades finally exploded, and now it's war. This episode is about that war, the American Civil War, one of the deadliest conflicts in history. Brother fought brother, cities were burned, and in the middle of it all, the fight for freedom took center stage. But before we begin, a quick request. If this podcast has helped you understand the history a little better, or if it sparked a thought you hadn't considered before, consider sharing it with a friend or rate us wherever you are listening. It's a small gesture that helps me keep going. Now, let's go back to the moment when the country finally broke apart and the first shots of war echoed across Charleston Harbor. Before a single bullet was fired, the Civil War had already begun, not on battlefields, but in speeches, courtrooms, newspapers, and even family dinner tables. The root of the fight was not just about slavery. Though slavery stood at the very heart of it, it was also about power. Who had the final say? The national government or the individual states? Could a state choose to leave the Union if it didn't like what was happening in Washington? And more deeply, could one half of the country continue depending on enslaved labor while the other half moved towards freedom and industrialization? The Southern economy, especially states like South Carolina, Georgia, and Mississippi, was deeply tied to cotton, and cotton depended on enslaved people. The North, on the other hand, was becoming more urban and industrial. It had its own problems, but by 1850s, many in North had started calling slavery a moral evil. That made Southern leaders nervous. To them, it felt like country was tilting against their way of life. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 without a single Southern electoral vote, that fear turned into action. Even though Lincoln promised not to end slavery where it already existed, Southern states saw his victory as a threat. They believed their voice no longer mattered, and one by one they left the Union. South Carolina was the first, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. In a matter of weeks, they formed their own country, the Confederate States of America. They wrote a new constitution, chose Jefferson Davis as their president, and took control of federal forts and arsenal within their borders. Meanwhile, Lincoln hadn't even taken office yet. When he did in March 1861, he faced a question no president had ever faced before. Can a state leave the Union? And if it does, what should the government do about it? Lincoln believed that the Union was meant to last forever, that the states didn't have the right to break away on their own. But he also didn't want to start a war. He hoped somehow that the crisis could still be solved without violence. But that hope would not last long. It all came down to a small island fort in South Carolina, Fort Sumter, sitting at the entrance of Charleston Harbor. It was one of the few military posts in the South still under Union control. Inside were a handful of US soldiers. The supplies were running low, and they were surrounded by Confederate forces. Lincoln had a choice: send help and risk war, or abandon the fort and seem weak. He chose to send food, not weapons, just food, making it clear he wasn't starting a fight, only trying to feed hungry men. But the Confederates saw even that as a threat. On April 12, 1861, before the food ships could arrive, Confederate cannons opened fire. For 34 long hours, shells lit up the sky over Charleston. The Union troops eventually surrendered, and amazingly, not a single person died in that bombardment. But the message was clear: the war had begun. And now the country had to choose sides. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to join the army and put down the rebellion. That call pushed even more states like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. to join the Confederacy. The line was drawn. This wasn't just a war between governments, it split towns, it split churches, it split families. There were brothers who ended up on opposite sides of the battlefield, cousins who would never speak again. States like Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland were torn right down the middle, officially staying in the Union but deeply divided inside. The North had the numbers, nearly 20 million people compared to the South, 9 million, and about 4 million of those in the South were enslaved. The North had factories, railroads, and more money, but the South had strong military leaders, the culture of fighting, and something else. The war was being fought on their land, which meant they were defending home turf. Most people thought the war would be over quickly. Some northern folks even packed picnics and rode out to watch the first battle like it was a weekend event. But war, as it turned out, is never that simple. The first major clash came just a few months later, July 1861, near a creek called Bull Run, just outside Washington, D.C. The Union Army, full of fresh volunteers in mismatched uniforms, marched out thinking this would be a quick, clean victory. Many thought the South would run at the first sign of real battle. But that's not what happened. Confederate troops stood firm. One general, Thomas Jackson, held his ground so fiercely that a fellow officer shouted, "There stands Jackson, like a stone wall." And from that moment, he was known as Stonewall Jackson. The Union Army was pushed back, then panicked and fled. What was supposed to be a short show of strength turned into a humiliating defeat. That battle, the first battle of Bull Run, shattered the illusion that this would be over soon. People realized this war would be long, bloody, and painful. As more battles followed in places like Shiloh, Wilson's Creek, and the Shenandoah Valley, both sides had to adjust to new realities. The scale of death was something Americans had never seen before. Rifles had become more accurate, cannon fire more deadly. But military tactics hadn't caught up. Soldiers were still charging in rows, straight into bullets. Thousands died, often in a single day, and those who survived faced diseases, infections, and amputations without proper medicine. Camps were full of lice, dirty water, and bad food. For every soldier who died in battle, two more died from illness. But life on the home front wasn't easy either. Families waited for letters. Mothers sent their sons off to war, sometimes never to hear from them again. Women stepped into roles they had never filled before, running farms, managing stores, even becoming nurses near battlefields. One such nurse, Clara Burton, would later go on to found the American Red Cross. And all through this, both sides believed they were fighting for something noble. The Union believed in saving the country, the Confederacy believed in defending their rights. But as the war dragged on, the meaning of the fight would begin to shift from just saving the Union to something even bigger, the freedom of millions of enslaved people. In the beginning, Abraham Lincoln had one goal: save the Union, not end slavery, at least not right away. He believed that if he came out strongly against slavery from the start, he might push the border states like Kentucky and Maryland to join Confederacy. That would have been a disaster for the Union war effort. But as the war dragged on, things changed. Lincoln began to see that slavery was not just a side issue, it was the engine driving the Confederate war machine. Slavery kept the South's economy running, allowed white men to go fight while enslaved people worked the land, and gave the Confederacy confidence that their way of life would endure. Ending slavery would hit the Confederacy where it hurt. So, in the middle of the war, Lincoln took a bold step. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Now, it didn't free every enslaved person right away. Only those in areas still in rebellion, not in border state loyal to the Union. But it changed everything. The Civil War was no longer just about saving the Union, it had become the fight for freedom. And for the first time, black men were allowed to join the Union Army. Nearly 180,000 African Americans eventually served, many of them formerly enslaved. They fought not just for a country, but for their own future. One of the most famous black units was the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, led by a white officer, Robert Gould Shaw. Their bravery at the Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina, where many were killed, proved to the nation that black soldiers were just as courageous and committed as anyone else. The South, of course, refused to recognize them as soldiers. Captured black troops were often executed or sold back to slavery. But they kept fighting, believing that victory for the Union meant liberty for their families and generations to come. Lincoln himself would later say that without the help of black troops, the Union might not have won the war at all. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't end slavery in all of America. That would come later with the 13th Amendment. But it shifted the moral compass of the war. Now the world saw the Union not just as a government putting down a rebellion, but as a nation trying to end human bondage. By the middle of the war, both sides were exhausted, physically, emotionally, and financially. But the tide was about to turn. A few key battles would shift momentum towards the Union and give Lincoln a stronger hand, both at home and abroad. The first major turning point came in September 1862 at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had taken his army to the Northern Territory, hoping a big win would convince European countries like Britain and France to support the South. But the Union forces under General George McClellan met him near Antietam Creek. The battle was brutal. In just one day, over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. It remains the bloodiest single day in American history. Technically, it was a draw, but since Lee had to retreat, the Union claimed it as a victory. And that was enough for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation just days later. He used that moment to shift the purpose of the war. Then came Gettysburg, the most famous battle of the entire war. In July 1863, Lee tried again to invade the North, this time in Pennsylvania. The Union Army under General George Meade met him in the hills and fields near the small town of Gettysburg. For 3 days, soldiers fought in burning heat across the wheat fields, ridges, and stone walls. On the final day, the Confederates launched what became known as Pickett's Charge, a desperate march across open ground under heavy Union fire. It failed. Lee was forced to retreat again, and the South would never recover its full strength. At Gettysburg, over 50,000 men were killed or wounded. The town became a giant graveyard. Months later, Lincoln came to speak at the opening of a cemetery. In just a few short minutes, he gave what became one of the most famous speeches in US history, the Gettysburg Address. He reminded the nation that this war was about more than survival. It was about the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And of course, I learned the same words as the definition of democracy back in India. Those words were that famous. Around the same time in the West, Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant captured the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi after a long siege. This gave the Union complete control over Mississippi River, cutting the Confederacy in half. It was a major strategic win. By late 1863, two things were clear. The Union had momentum and the South was starting to run out of options. By 1864, the Union's strategy had changed. It was no longer just about winning battles. Now it was about breaking the South's ability and will to fight. This was the age of total war. The man who would lead this next phase was General William Tecumseh Sherman. He believed that to truly end the war, the South's economy and morale had to be crushed. That meant going beyond the battlefield, targeting railroads, factories, crops, even civilian homes that supported the war effort. Sherman's most famous campaign was the March to the Sea. He led his army from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, cutting a path 60 miles wide. His men burned fields, tore up train tracks, destroyed warehouses, not to kill people, but to shock the South into giving up. And it worked. Cities fell quickly. Confederate soldiers deserted in large numbers. The sight of Sherman's unstoppable army moving through Georgia terrified the South. But it also left scars. Homes destroyed, families uprooted, and entire towns turned into ashes. Even today, some Southerners remember Sherman's march with bitterness. Meanwhile, the home front, especially in the South, was under enormous pressure. With so many men away at war, women had to run farms, raise children, and keep communities going. Food shortages became common. Inflation made everything expensive. People boiled leather for soup. Some even rioted for bread. In the north, life was more stable but still stressful. Factories worked around the clock to supply troops. Young men were being drafted, and not everyone supported the war. In New York City, draft protests turned violent. Angry crowds, especially poor immigrants, attacked draft officers and even black citizens, blaming them for the war. It was one of the worst riots in American history. Despite the pain, many Northerners stayed committed. Lincoln had been up for re election in 1864, and for a while it looked like he might lose. But after Sherman captured Atlanta, Northern voters rallied behind him. Lincoln won, and he took that as a sign that the people wanted to finish what they had started. As winter turned to spring, it became clear the end of the war was near, but the final days would still be deadly. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Its armies were shrinking, its railroads destroyed, and its cities under siege. Many Southern soldiers were barefoot, hungry, and tired. The Confederate government had even begun debating whether to arm enslaved people, something that showed just how desperate they had become. Meanwhile, General Ulysses S. Grant was pressing hard against Robert E. Lee in Virginia, while Sherman's army was marching north through Carolinas. They were burning what was left for the South's ability to fight. On April 2nd, Union troops finally broke through the Confederate lines around Richmond, the Confederate capital. Jefferson Davis and his officials fled the city. It went up in flames as they left. A week later, on April 9, 1865, Lee met Grant in a quiet farmhouse in Appomattox Courthouse. It wasn't dramatic. No angry words, no last stand. Lee, dressed in full uniform, surrendered his army. Grant, muddy and tired, offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could go home, keep their horses, and would not be punished. Grant even ordered his troop not to cheer. He said the defeated were still fellow Americans. The Civil War was over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery as an institution was finished legally, if not yet fully in practice, but the cost had been unbearable. More than 620,000 Americans had died, more than in any other war in US history, even to this day. Whole towns had lost nearly every young man. Cities like Richmond, Atlanta, and Columbia were in ruins. The South's economy was shattered, and millions of newly freed people were now facing an uncertain future. Free, but with no land, no money, and no protection. And then, just days after victory, tragedy struck. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln went out to relax for the first time in years. He had been through 4 years of civil war, and finally, peace seemed possible. That night, he attended a comedy play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He was accompanied with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and two guests. But someone else was in the building, someone who did not see peace the same way Lincoln did. His name was John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and a strong supporter of the Confederacy. Booth believed Lincoln was a tyrant, and he hated what the president had done to the South. He had originally planned to kidnap Lincoln, hoping to use him as a bargaining chip. But after the South surrendered, Booth's plan turned darker. At around 10:15 p.m., during a moment of laughter in the play, Booth slipped into presidential box. He aimed a small pistol and shot Lincoln in the back of his head. Then he jumped onto the stage and shouted something like, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants." He broke his leg in the fall but managed to escape. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house. He never regained consciousness. Early the next morning, April 15th, he died. His Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, stood at his side and said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The shock was immediate. People poured into streets crying openly. In cities like New York and Philadelphia, churches rang their bells and flags were lowered. Across the North, there was an overwhelming sense of grief as though the father of the country had been taken away. In the South, reactions were mixed. Some were silent, others quietly celebrated, though few realized how deeply Lincoln's loss would affect the post war world. Booth fled, but he didn't get far. After nearly 2 weeks on the run, Union soldiers found him hiding in a barn in Virginia. He refused to surrender, and the barn was set on fire. Booth was shot and died from his wounds. But the story didn't end there. Lincoln's assassination was part of a larger plot. His group had planned to kill other leaders too, Vice President Andrew Jackson and Secretary of State William Seward, hoping to throw the government into chaos. Seward was stabbed in his own home that same night, but he survived. The man sent to kill Johnson lost his nerve and ran away. In the days that followed, a huge investigation led to the arrest of several conspirators. 4 of them, including a woman named Mary Surratt, were hanged, the first woman ever executed by the US government. Others were sent to prison, but some people still believe the whole truth may not have been revealed. Over the years, conspiracy theories have grown. Some suggest Booth had secret help from people inside the government or from high-ranking Confederates who escaped justice. Others wonder whether the assassination was meant to stop Lincoln's softer plans for rebuilding the South. We may never know the full story, but one thing is clear. His death changed the direction of history. Lincoln had hoped for peace without punishment. He wanted to bring the South back gently, but with him gone, power passed to Andrew Johnson, a much less skilled and more controversial leader. The nation would enter a difficult and often bitter period called Reconstruction. The war was over, but peace wasn't simple. The Union had been saved, slavery was ending, and the battlefield had just gone quiet. But the hardest question still had no answers. What would freedom actually look like for 4 million people who had just been released from slavery? Would they get land, jobs, protection? And what about southern states? Should they be punished or welcomed back? Who would rebuild the cities, the farms, and the broken hearts? Lincoln had been imagining a gentle path forward, with malice towards none. He said, with charity for all. But after his assassination, that vision faded. His successor, Andrew Jackson, was a man from the South who had stayed loyal to the Union. But he lacked Lincoln's wisdom, patience, and respect. Under Johnson's leadership, Reconstruction would become a messy, painful, and often violent chapter in American history. Northern politicians argued with each other. Southern leaders tried to hold on to old powers. New laws were made, but old hatred remained. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan rose up to terrorize newly freed black Americans. And while 13th Amendment ended slavery, the promise of freedom, equality, and justice remained painfully out of reach for many. Still, in the midst of that struggle, black communities began to rise, starting schools, churches, and businesses. They elected officials, they voted. They built a new identity in a country that had once treated them as a property. The Civil War had saved the Union, but the battle for the soul of the country was not yet over. Reconstruction would decide what kind of nation the United States would become, not just for white Americans, but for everyone. And that is the story we will begin in our next episode. Thank you for listening. If this episode moved you, challenged you, or taught you something new, please follow, rate, and share the podcast. It keeps the story alive. I am Santosh, and this has been US History, Understanding This Country. Until next time, stay curious, take care.